Mark Levin's voice cut through the studio like a jagged blade, sharp, unrelenting, drowning out Jasmine Crockett mid-sentence for the fourth time. His words weren't questions, they were interruptions, louder, harsher, each one meant to bulldoze her point before it could even take root. The camera caught him leaning forward, finger jabbing the air as though authority alone could silence reason, but Crockett didn't flinch. Her eyes locked on him with steady fire, her posture upright, unyielding. She let him finish his rant not because he deserved the space, but because she knew what was coming next would not be forgotten. And then, with a calm edge that sliced deeper than any raised voice ever could, she said it. "Mark, I've given you 3 chances to hear me out. This 4th time you don't get to talk over me. You're not louder because you're right. You're just louder because you're afraid." The words hit like a strike of lightning. Levin blinked, his mouth open, but empty. Caught between his habit of dominating and the sudden realization that domination was no longer an option, the audience in the studio froze. Even the producers used to chaos leaned closer to their monitors. The silence stretched, thick with shock. For the first time that night, Levin had nothing to say. And in that pause, Crockett's voice carried further than any shout could. "You don't get to erase my voice. Not here, not now, not ever." The studio went silent. America held its breath across the country. Living rooms and smartphones lit up with this exact moment. Hearts pounding with recognition. Here was a woman refusing to be bulldozed. Here was dignity standing its ground against arrogance. Clips were already racing toward virality before she had even finished speaking. But beneath the explosion of that single instant lay a bigger story of patterns. 3 interruptions before this one, of a man convinced that loudness equals power. It's a woman who had seen enough to know better. And so the real question was not how she silenced him, but why he thought he could silence her in the first place. Because this wasn't the first time. Mark Levin tried to shut her down. It was the 4th, and the story behind it reveals everything. It wasn't just any broadcast. It wasn't some quiet exchange in the corner of a newsroom or a local program destined to be forgotten by morning. This was prime time, national airwaves, the kind of stage where reputations are forged and destroyed, where millions tune in not only for answers, but for theater, for clarity, for a glimpse at what America is becoming. The studio lights were bright, the microphones unforgiving, every syllable amplified into living rooms across the country. On one side sat Mark Levin, a man known as much for his volume as for his ideology. He thrived on confrontation, carried himself with the certainty that whoever spoke loudest would be remembered longest. His interruptions were not accidents, they were tactics. To Levin, domination was debate. And so when Jasmine Crockett joined him on that stage, he assumed the same playbook would work again. But Crockett was no ordinary guest. A congresswoman who had built her reputation not on sound bites but on service, she carried into that studio the calm weight of lived struggle. Her voice was measured, passionate without shouting, determined without theatrics. She understood that in a country as divided as America, composure itself could be a weapon, and dignity could be the sharpest. Rebuttal of all. What made this clash different? What raised the stakes far beyond a simple back and forth was what their exchange symbolized. At its core, it was never just about policy. It was about who gets to be heard, whose story is allowed to breathe, whose voice, in the battle for America's soul, gets drowned out in real time before the cameras. For generations, the table of power had been set for voices like Levin's, loud male, certain of their entitlement to the floor. Crockett's presence interrupted that tradition as much as her words interrupted his narrative. She stood there as more than herself, a black woman, a public servant, an embodiment of every person who had been spoken over, disregarded, or told they didn't belong. So when Levin cut her off again and again, it wasn't simply rude, it was symbolic. It was a reenactment of a larger silencing that so many watching knew intimately. When Crockett finally drew her line in the sand, the tension in that studio rippled outward into homes across the country. Because for viewers, this wasn't just her fight, it was theirs. Every glare, every lean forward, Every raised decibel from Levin said, "You don't matter as much as I do." And every steady word, every breath held by Crockett before she spoke, said, "Watch me prove you wrong." The stakes were not just the outcome of one broadcast. They were the dignity of representation itself. Could a woman of color claim her rightful place in the national conversation without being bulldozed into silence? Could calm clarity defeat arrogance in real time? Could millions of viewers see in Crockett's resistance the validation of their own lived experiences? And that is why this moment mattered. It wasn't background noise in the political machine, it was a flashpoint. Because what happened next wasn't just about one interview. It became a symbol of how women of color are treated when they dare to speak truth on national TV. And yet, the answer to why it hit so hard, why it carried such weight, lies not just in Crockett's response, but in Levin's history. To understand the power of that fourth interruption, you have to rewind. Because long before that silence in the studio, there was a pattern, and patterns, once revealed, tell us everything. To understand why Mark Levin's fourth interruption was more than a single clash, you have to understand the man himself, the brand he built, the style he perfected, and the arrogance that has become his signature. Levin didn't emerge in American political media by accident. He carved out a space for himself with a voice that was equal parts bombast and certainty. A voice that didn't just comment on politics, but demanded submission from those who dared to oppose him. For years, his broadcasts have carried the same rhythm, a relentless barrage of words spoken quickly, loudly, layered with disdain for his opponents. To some, this style reads as confidence, even authority. But for those who have been on the receiving end, it feels like a bulldozer rolling through a conversation, flattening nuance, suffocating dissent. Levin's fans celebrate him as uncompromising. They say he refuses to play nice in a world where political correctness has tied to many tongues. But strip away the applause, and a pattern emerges: his refusal to engage on equal terms. The moment someone challenges his narrative, his voice rises. The moment a guest dares to take up space, he talks faster, louder, till their words dissolve beneath the weight of his interruptions. Time and again, his strategy has been the same. Don't debate, dominate. It's easier to win if your opponent never finishes a sentence. It's easier to appear strong if the audience never hears the cracks in your own arguments. Arrogance becomes armor, and volume becomes a shield. And yet, hidden in that pattern is Levin's fragility. Because when his control slips, when someone refuses to be drowned out, he doesn't know where to turn. The man who thrives on chaos suddenly falters when composure is weaponized against him. His power is rooted in performance, not substance. And when the performance fails, so does the illusion of authority. There are countless examples. Guests who tried to speak only to be cut off mid-thought. Callers who asked difficult questions, dismissed as nonsense before they could finish. Political opponents labeled with insults, caricatured instead of engaged, each time the same dynamic played out. Levin in command, his voice towering, the other reduced to background noise. To his supporters, this aggression felt like strength. But to his critics, it exposed an insecurity and inability to tolerate dissent, a fear that if other voices were truly heard, his own would be revealed as weaker than he pretended. This is why his confrontation with Jasmine Crockett carried so much weight. Levin had spent a career sharpening a single tool, interruption, as domination. And it worked time after time. Because his opponents either matched his anger, falling into his trap, or shrank beneath it, leaving him victorious by sheer volume. But Crockett was different. She didn't rise to his bait, nor did she retreat. Her calm dismantled his chaos. Her composure left his aggression looking desperate, childish even. And in that moment, Levin's pattern collided with someone uniquely prepared to expose its weaknesses. For all his years of interruptions, all his habits of silencing, all his reliance on arrogance, Levin had never quite faced someone like her. A woman who understood that dignity itself could be an act of defiance. A woman who knew that sometimes the sharpest weapon is not to shout louder, but to speak clearer. And so, by the time he met Crockett on live TV, he thought he could steamroll. Her, like so many others, he was wrong. Before Jasmine Crockett became the Congresswoman who froze a national broadcast with her steady rebuke. She was a fighter long before cameras ever found her. Her story didn't begin under the glare of studio lights or on Capitol Hill. It began in neighborhoods where being overlooked was routine, where justice wasn't handed down easily, where voices like hers had to be sharpened in the fire of struggle. Crockett's path started with the law. She trained as an attorney not for prestige or personal gain, but because she saw firsthand how easily the system swallowed people whole. Families broke under the weight of fines, young men locked away without fair defense, communities treated as disposable. She refused to look away. Instead, she stepped into courtrooms armed with discipline and resolve, determined to turn her education into a weapon for the overlooked there. In those courtrooms, she learned the art of composure. Judges cut her off. Opposing counsel tried to rattle her. Clients came in defeated, certain the system would never hear them. Crockett understood that losing her cool would only hand victory to the other side. So she honed a skill that would define her political career, the ability to remain unshaken while the storm raged around her. Calm became her shield. Precision became her blade. That discipline didn't come without cost. It required sacrifice, nights poring over case files, endless days carrying not just her own ambitions, but the hopes of clients who had no one else to fight for them. The courtroom became her training ground, sharpening not only her legal instincts, but her patience, her endurance. Her refusal to yield when she stepped into public service, those same qualities carried her forward. Crockett entered politics, not as a careerist chasing power, but as an advocate determined to scale her fight from one courtroom to an entire community, from one client to entire constituencies. In town halls and legislative chambers, she brought the same unflinching presence. Listen first, speak with precision. Never allow arrogance to silence truth. What made her different? What made her so dangerous to someone like Levin was that she was immune to the tactics that usually worked on others. Where others crumbled under interruption, she had endured far worse in the judicial arena. Where others grew flustered at being talked over, she had spent years learning to wait for her turn, then strike with clarity so undeniable it could not be ignored. Every lived struggle became part of her armor. Ace, being underestimated as a black woman in spaces where her presence alone unsettled tradition. Being dismissed by opponents who assumed her calmness meant weakness, only to be stunned when her words landed with the force of a hammer. Being treated as if she was trespassing in the halls of power, only to claim those halls with dignity that demanded recognition. For Crockett, interruptions were not new. They were familiar echoes of every time someone tried to cut short her sentence. Her argument, her very right to exist in the room, and rather than weaken her, those interruptions had forged her resolve. That is why the Levin broadcast carried more weight than anyone realized in the moment. For him, the interruptions were a tactic. For her, they were reminders of every courtroom where she'd been underestimated, every committee where her presence unsettled the status quo, every stage where she'd been told to sit down and let someone else take the microphone. But Crockett's philosophy was simple. Dignity is not given, it is claimed. And she had spent her entire life preparing to claim it, no matter how many times someone tried to shout her down. So when Levin cut her off the first time, she absorbed it. When he cut her off the second, she noted the pattern. By the third, she understood exactly what he was trying to do and why. And by the fourth, she was ready. Every interruption wasn't just noise, it was fuel. It built the anticipation, sharpened her response, ensured that when she finally delivered her words, they would land like thunder. Her journey had taught her patience. Her struggles had taught her strength. Her service had taught her who she was fighting for, not just herself, but every voice that had been silenced, every community that had been ignored, every person who had been told their story didn't matter. So in that studio, when the fourth interruption came, Crockett wasn't flustered. She wasn't shaken. She was prepared. Her entire life had been preparing her for that moment. And when she finally answered him, it wasn't only Levin who felt the weight of her words. It was everyone watching, everyone who had ever felt erased, everyone who had ever needed someone to prove that silence can be broken and arrogance can be defeated. Because when Mark Levin tried to cut Jasmine Crockett off for the fourth time, he didn't realize she was no longer just answering him. She was answering history. The debate began with an air of formality, but it didn't take long before the cracks showed. Levin leaned in, voice cutting across the table before Crockett had finished her first point. It was swift, sharp, dismissive. Kind of interruption that came so naturally to him it barely registered as unusual. For a moment Crockett paused, letting his words tumble out in a rush. She drew a breath, waited for his volume to taper, then re-entered the conversation with a measured calm that contrasted his bluster like night to day. The second interruption came harder. This time Levin didn't even let her finish a sentence. He raised his hand slightly as if he were the arbiter of time, his voice booming over hers as though the microphone belonged exclusively to him. Crockett's eyes narrowed, but her posture didn't shift. She steadied her voice, lowered it just enough to make the audience lean in, and pressed on. The dignity in her composure only highlighted the arrogance in his intrusion. Viewers watching from home began to stir. Social media feeds lit up in real time with comments and clipped reactions. Why won't he let her speak? Owns the stage? The unease was spreading because the pattern was becoming clear. This wasn't debate, this was dismissal. By the third interruption, the tension was undeniable. Levin's tone grew almost frantic, as if the very presence of Crockett's unshaken voice threatened the foundation of his argument. He wasn't debating policy anymore. He was battling for dominance, clawing for control of the air itself. His interruptions grew sharper, his body language louder. Raised his voice to a pitch that bordered on desperate, filling every corner of the studio with noise, but Crockett? She didn't take the bait. She didn't match his decibels. She didn't break her cadence. Instead, she leaned slightly forward, eyes steady, waiting for her turn like a runner waiting at the starting line. Each time he cut her off, she let him finish. Each time he threw words over her, she held them in the air with a silence that refused to be broken. Her calm was her weapon, her refusal to flinch a kind of defiance that made his interruptions look less like strength and more like panic. Inside the studio, the audience shifted in their seats. The murmurs were audible now, the discomfort thick enough to feel. Even the producers behind the glass exchanged glances. How many times could he cut her off before it stopped looking like debate and started looking like bullying? And on the internet, the moment was already beginning to pulse with electricity. Clips were ripped live from the feed, posted with captions 3 times now. She hasn't even been allowed to finish a thought. The comments stacked by the second, outrage brewing, curiosity mounting. Crockett, for her part, I don't know exactly what was happening. Each interruption wasn't just disrespect, it was a stage being set. She understood the rhythm, the escalation. The moment approaching like thunder on the horizon, she let him talk, let him expose his arrogance. Let the audience grow restless with impatience because, by the third interruption, it was no longer just a clash between two voices. It was the entire country watching one man try to bulldoze a woman of color on national television and waiting, almost aching, to see what she would do next. And so the air thickened. The stakes rose, and the silence between interruptions became as loud as the interruptions themselves. Everyone watching could feel it. Something was about to break. By the third time, Levin cut her off. It was clear something explosive was about to happen. The fourth interruption came not as a surprise, but as an inevitability. Levin lunged in again, his words spilling over hers like a dam bursting, voice swelling with the same authority he had wielded for years. He didn't even wait for her to complete a phrase. His instinct told him to overpower, to claim space by force of noise alone. His body leaned forward, hand slicing through the air as if commanding the conversation to obey, but this time, something shifted. Crockett stopped, mid-sentence. Not because he had silenced her, but because she chose silence as her weapon. She folded her hands on the desk, leaned back just slightly, and let him continue. The studio lights reflected in her eyes, unblinking, unwavering, as though she were watching a child throw a tantrum. The audience noticed. So did Levin. When he finally ran out of steam, his voice trailing into a sputter, Crockett let the silence stretch. A silence so deliberate, so cutting, it became louder than his shouting. Viewers could feel it from their couches, the gravity of that pause, the weight of anticipation, as though the country itself leaned closer to the screen. Then, in a voice low, clear, and edged with iron, she spoke. "Mark, I've allowed you 3 times to interrupt me, 3 times to shout me down. But here's the truth. Being louder doesn't make you right. It only makes you afraid." Gasps rippled through the studio. Levin blinked, stunned. His mouth twitched as though searching for words that refused to arrive. The control he had wielded so casually, the dominance he took for granted, had been flipped on its head in an instant. Crockett didn't stop there. She leaned forward, her voice steady, her cadence deliberate, slicing through his interruptions point by point like a surgeon dismantling a fragile case. "You interrupted me when I talked about justice. You interrupted me when I talked about dignity. You interrupted me when I talked about service. And now you've interrupted me once again, because deep down you know you can't face what I'm saying." She held his gaze. The silence between each line made the words echo louder than any shouting match ever could. The rhythm was unmistakable. Accusation, pause, truth. Accusation, pause, truth. It was the rhythm of a courtroom closing argument, honed from years of training and sharpened by battles where stakes were life and liberty. Levin shifted uncomfortably. He opened his mouth, but no sound came. For the first time that evening, his voice abandoned him. Crockett pressed on, words rising not in volume but in power. "You don't get to erase my voice, Mark. Not here. Not tonight. Because when you try to shout over me, you're not just shouting over me. You're shouting over every woman who's been told to sit down. You're shouting over every Black American who's been told their story doesn't matter. You're shouting over every citizen who's been silenced because someone else decided their voice wasn't worth hearing. And I will not let you do that." The room froze. Levin's reputation had always been built on the force of his interruptions, on his ability to twist a conversation into submission. But now he looked small, reduced not by anger, but by the composure sitting across from him. And beyond the studio, the ripple began instantly. Viewers clipped the exchange and flooded social media. "This is it." She shut him down with dignity. 3 times he tried, and on the 4th, she made history. Within minutes, hashtags trended. Millions watched the clip replayed, again and again, dissected frame by frame. The lean, the silence, the devastating delivery. But in that moment, Crockett wasn't thinking about hashtags or trends. She was thinking about every interruption that had led to this one. She was thinking about the pattern she had seen unfold again and again, not just with Levin, but with voices like his across the country. And she was determined that this time would not end the same way. She straightened her posture, her voice unwavering. Respect is not optional. Dignity is not negotiable. And I will not allow arrogance to drown out truth. "You've had your turn, now it's mine." The audience erupted. "Nah." In cheers, not in laughter, but in a stunned hush, the kind that carries more weight than applause. It was the sound of recognition, of validation, of a country seeing something long overdue. Arrogance stopped in its tracks, dignity refusing to yield. Levin tried to gather himself. But his jaw tightened, his hands clenched, his eyes darted as though searching for a lifeline in a sea of silence. He leaned into the microphone, ready to reclaim the space, to throw his weight behind one final counterstrike. But the veneer of authority was gone, cracked under the precision of her words. Crockett turned slightly toward the audience, not away from him but beyond him, as if speaking to the nation rather than the man in front of her. "Every interruption you made tonight was a reminder of what so many of us face every single day. But let this be clear, when you try to silence me, you only make me louder. When you try to erase me, you only make me stronger. And when you try to talk over me, you prove exactly why. My voice needs to be heard." Levin opened his mouth again, desperate to claw back control. And when Levin tried to fire back, his voice cracked. The country noticed the silence in the studio did not remain confined to that room, spilled outward, captured in real time by millions of viewers who felt the gravity of what they had just witnessed. Within minutes of the broadcast ending, phones lit up, screens buzzed, and the digital roar began to swell. Social media caught fire, not with policy debates or fact-check threads, but with a single moment of undeniable clarity. Jasmine Crockett shutting Levin down. On Twitter, hashtags like hashtag Crockett shutdown, hashtag let her speak, and hashtag dignity wins shot up the trending charts. Clips of the exchange flooded timelines, replayed in slow motion with captions that highlighted the silence after Crockett's words. TikTok stitched the clip into endless variations. One edit framed her rebuttal over dramatic movie soundtracks. Another placed text across the screen. This is how you deal with arrogance. Instagram reels filled with memes of Levin's faltering expression, side by side with Crockett's unshaken gaze. The internet had chosen its hero and its villain. Levin became a punchline, mocked as the man who could interrupt 3 times, but collapsed on the 4th. Memes showed him talking into a void, his voice scribbled out in captions while Crockett's words glowed in bold letters. One viral tweet read, "Levin learned tonight that dignity speaks louder than arrogance ever will." Crockett, meanwhile, was elevated. Not just as the winner of a debate, but as a symbol of something larger. Colleagues in Congress praised her composure. Activists called her a voice for the silenced. Celebrities amplified the moment to their millions of followers. Actors, musicians, athletes, all sharing the clip with captions like "This is leadership," and "She said what needed to be said." Even those who hadn't seen the broadcast itself couldn't escape the tidal wave. The clip became unavoidable, appearing on news recaps, morning shows, and political commentary programs. Pundits replayed the moment in loops, dissecting every second. Levin's raised hand. The silence Crockett held, the delivery of her lines, the crack in his attempted comeback. It was less a debate highlight and more a cultural event, replayed, until it burned itself into collective memory. For Crockett's supporters, it was vindication. For those who had ever been interrupted, dismissed, or silenced, the clip became a rallying cry. Comment sections filled with people sharing their own experiences. "I know exactly how she feels, men cutting me off at work." This wasn't just a debate. This was every meeting I've ever sat in. Crockett's mic drop wasn't simply entertainment. It was a mirror held up to daily indignities millions endure. And as the wave of validation surged, so did her profile. Overnight, Crockett was no longer just another voice on a crowded stage. She was a national figure, a rising star whose composure under fire became her brand. Interviews poured in. Requests for commentary multiplied. Her words were quoted not just in political spaces, but in lifestyle magazines, leadership blogs, and even sports commentary anywhere. Dignity was valued over bluster. Meanwhile, Levin found himself in unfamiliar territory. The man who prided himself on controlling every conversation was now the subject of ridicule. Critics replayed his faltering voice, noting how quickly arrogance crumbled when met with composure. His usual defenders offered little. Some tried to reframe the exchange, calling Crockett to rehearse, but those excuses faltered against the sheer authenticity of the clip. The internet had decided the verdict. It was final. He lost. What made the aftermath so powerful wasn't just the humor of the memes or the sharpness of Crockett's words. It was the resonance. People weren't just laughing at Levin, they were celebrating Crockett, holding her up as proof that dignity still mattered, that truth could still pierce through arrogance, that a calm, clear voice could silence even the loudest noise. This was bigger than a single broadcast. It was a cultural checkpoint, a reminder that representation wasn't abstract. It was tangible, visible. It felt in the marrow of the nation when someone like Crockett refused to yield. But beyond the viral buzz, something deeper resonated. When the dust settled, Crockett was the first to reframe the moment. She didn't bask in the praise or claim victory as her own. Instead, she looked directly into the camera during a follow-up interview and said words that would echo far beyond the studio. "This isn't about me, it's about every voice that's been silenced." Her choice to step outside herself transformed the debate from a clash of egos into a lesson about respect, representation, and resilience. She knew the headlines were framing it as Crockett versus Levin, but to her, the deeper truth was about The millions watching who had seen themselves in her composure, her restraint, and finally, in her calm but devastating counterattack, she reminded the audience that arrogance is loud but fragile. While truth is steady and enduring, she pointed out that interruptions are not just impolite, they are a tactic, a way of denying dignity, a method of erasure. And she declared that dignity always outlasts dominance, because arrogance crumbles under the weight of its own insecurity. The moral lesson was simple, yet profound. When someone tries to silence you, your power is not in matching their noise, but in holding your ground with clarity. Crockett became living proof that restraint is not weakness. It is strategy, and it can be sharper than any raised voice. For many watching, her words lifted a burden they hadn't realized they were carrying. The office worker cut off in meetings. The student dismissed in class discussions. The community advocate told their voice didn't matter. All of them heard something bigger than a clapback. They heard validation. They heard proof that interruption is not the same as victory, and that being silenced in the moment doesn't mean being defeated in the end. Crockett's resolution also spoke to a broader vision of politics itself. She insisted that representation was not cosmetic, it was essential. Her ability to remain unshaken was born from her lived struggles, her discipline, her refusal to let anyone dictate the boundaries of her voice. In that way, she wasn't just speaking for herself. She was carrying the strength of communities who had endured generations of being talked over, ignored, or erased. The story resonated because it offered more than entertainment, it offered empowerment. Crockett didn't just win an exchange on live television. She modeled a way forward. She showed that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it speaks softly but firmly, and in doing so, it commands the room. For progressives, immigrants, women of color, and anyone who had ever questioned whether dignity could withstand arrogance, this moment was proof. Proof that arrogance is brittle, that bluster is no match for composure, and that truth delivered with grace can disarm even the loudest opposition. And so the moral crystallized: respect over interruption, dignity over dominance, truth over arrogance. Crockett became more than a participant in a viral moment. She became a symbol of resilience. As the audience reflected, they felt more than satisfaction. They felt pride. They felt validated. They felt empowered to carry themselves with the same strength the next time their voices were tested. Because Crockett's message was clear. The fight for dignity isn't just hers. It belongs to everyone who refuses to be silenced. Levin tried 3 times to cut her off. 3 times to derail her words. 3 times to drown her out. But on the 4th, Jasmine Crockett shut him down with calm precision, with dignity, with truth that left no room for arrogance to stand. That's the power of this moment. Not just a viral clip, not just a political skirmish, but a clear reminder that respect always outweighs interruption, that composure can dismantle chaos, and that when dignity speaks, the noise falls silent. Crockett didn't just win an argument. She showed us what strength looks like in real time. She turned every interruption into fuel, every dismissal into resolve. And when the 4th one came, she chose not to raise her voice, but to raise the standard. And that choice, measured, principled, unshaken, is what made the world stop and listen. This is why the moment matters, because it isn't just about her, it's about all of us. It's about refusing to be talked over, refusing to be erased, refusing to let arrogance dictate the terms of our worth. So let this be more than a clip you scroll past. Share this moment. Pass it on to someone who's been silenced before. Them see what it looks like to reclaim the room. And if you believe in amplifying voices that speak truth without fear, stay with us. Subscribe for more stories where dignity triumphs, where truth speaks louder than arrogance, where those who try to silence end up silenced themselves. Be part of the movement that refuses to be silenced, because the 4th time isn't the end of the story. It's just the beginning.